Hello, everybody. It is 3:30. Now, 3:29. A little early, but close enough to 3:30. So that, of course, means it's time for one of our after-school STEM shows. I'm just going to check my audio here real quick, so you're probably going to get a feedback loop for me here. One of our after-school STEM shows. Beautiful. Love it. And so today, we are going to be doing another React video. These have been doing okay-ish as far as stream numbers, and they're real easy for us, so I don't mind slipping these in every once in a while. But today, what we're going to be reacting to is another video from Tier Zoo, which, if you enjoy this video, we did one a couple weeks ago now, where Angie reacted to the bird tier list. I'm going to be reacting to the dinosaur tier list here today. And so Tier Zoo is a channel that I've been following for a couple years at this point, like on my own personal time. And so kind of the shtick with it is tier lists are kind of a popular-ish thing just in like the internet video space and have been for a few years. And so basically he comes up with a tier list, so kind of a ordered ranking by whatever criteria he's using of a list of usually animals, but he's done some plant stuff too. And so normally it's like kind of a how well does this thing survive out in the wild type of deal? How likely is this animal to continue existing if the climate goes the direction we're expecting the climate to go is kind of the shtick. But the larger gimmick is that he's treating it like the only place you'll see a tier list a lot of times is in like competitive video games. And so he is ranking animals as though they are basically characters in a video game. But before we do that, I want to give a shout out to the Beltrami Electric Co-op for underwriting these shows that we've been doing every day. And we've been doing these near daily. We've missed a day or two here and there for about 8 months now. It's been one thing that's kind of been added to the content here out of it's come out of COVID, and we're continuing to do these because we keep getting views on them, and it's a good way to get a little extra community outreach, keep us in people's minds. And so we go live on 3 platforms. So Twitch.tv is one that I tend to favor. It tends to, in my experience, give the best streaming experience. There tends to be a little bit more active chat there too. Facebook is another thing we stream on, so if you follow us on Facebook, the streams are there. We also do a live stream on YouTube as well. And so it's across all of them simultaneously. And then, at least on the days that we stream on YouTube, those videos then get automatically saved to our YouTube channel too. So if you miss one, you want to go back and watch it, something seems interesting to you, they're pretty much all on our YouTube. And so, with no further ado, I think I will start the video here.
The dinosaur clips in this video are from documentaries you can find on CuriosityStream. More on them at the end of the video.
Yeah, I'm just gonna do a quick sound check, make sure we've got audio here. Okay, yep. And so, we'll go back a couple frames there. But what's going on here is this dinosaur is using a beetle that it caught as bait to capture some other small thing that would come and eat the beetle, presumably. But I just wanted to give a quick highlight on this shot here, because I think this foot is a really interesting thing to look at. And we have an animal here at the Science Center that has a very similar looking foot to that in our bearded dragons. And so you can see just like how this guy is using his big long spindly fingers and big long claws to climb up a tree. Very similarly, bearded dragons do kind of the same thing, basically. Yeah, they're kind of interesting things. It's like the inventory and the health system and the mini maps here. There's a lot of visual gags for somebody who plays video games in these videos. Stamina meter here. Nope. Little mammal, one of our ancestors.
Dinosaurs were some of the most powerful builds to ever be introduced to the game. while other factions like the Mammal Guild and Arthropod Guild have come up with some pretty impressive ones. On land, nothing has yet topped the sheer power of the Reptile Guild's greatest achievements. Even though their massive size is perhaps their most notable trait, there was also a ton of variety in the abilities and combat strategies that these builds employed. And so today I think it's finally...
Yeah, and so he's talking about the scale of the dinosaurs, but it's kind of interesting to think about is how do we decide what's a dinosaur and what's not? And because there's a lot of prehistoric reptiles that exist, and before we could use genetics, and well, we still can't really use genetics because it's dinosaurs and it's all fossilized remains. But the way that they determine what's a dinosaur versus just another big prehistoric reptile, the defining trait of dinosaurs is that their legs are underneath them. They walk standing upright, basically, in a way that no other reptiles do. So you can think of a turtle or an alligator, for example, where the arms kind of splay out to either side, whereas with dinosaurs, they're underneath them. And the big benefit of that is they were really the first terrestrial things to do that, the first things that were living on land and had legs that were designed that way. So it let them move a lot further and more efficiently over dry land and let them get further away from water than what anything previous to them had been able to do. And then just as a general reptile thing, the big innovation that reptiles brought to the table that really let them become the dominant thing on dry land was the hard-shelled eggs. Everything that came before them had eggs that needed to be laid in water and then had wet skin that needed to stay wet, so they couldn't get very far away from water ever. But dinosaurs and the precursor reptiles to dinosaurs all not needing to have wet skin, not needing to lay their eggs in water, and then having the legs that were underneath them let them travel into a much broader range of environments than anything before them had been able to.
Finally time to release my dinosaur tier list. Obviously there's a ton of dinosaur builds, so there's no way I can cover all of them, but I definitely will try to hit the important ones. It's worth noting that the reign of the dinosaur faction lasted more than twice as long as the reign of the mammal faction that supplanted them. And so during this huge stretch of time, dinosaur maids basically tried out every conceivable strategy, and that's why there are so many builds to talk about.
Yeah, and the scale of time that dinosaurs and reptiles were the dominant thing is hard to even really fathom, to be honest, because we think of humans, all of human history, anatomically modern humans, you're talking about 200,000 years ago. The chimp versus human divide is about 5.5 to 6 million years ago, and that's dinosaurs have been extinct for over 60 million years, and they existed and were, like I said, pretty much the dominant thing on the planet for 200 plus million years before that. Started the Triassic period is maybe 300 million years ago or so. Nobody fact check me on that. It's something like that. But you're talking about a couple 100 million years, which is, I said, in the scope of living things on this planet is a long time. A lot longer than mammals have made it and probably will make it.
But as always, we'll start from the bottom of the tier list and move up from there. At the bottom, we've got Dryosaurus and Camptosaurus, two very similar herbivore builds with an interesting stat spread. Dinosaurs are known for their immense strength, but neither of these builds boast any sort of offensive capabilities. Instead, they have a modest but below average defensive spread, decent mobility, and above average intelligence for a dinosaur. These builds took advantage of how powerful the other herbivore builds were by sticking by the bulkier ones and relying on them to defend the herd. They also took advantage of the...
So yeah, these are relatively early dinosaurs that you're seeing in this first set of clip. And those kind of iguanodon-y looking ones is what he's talking about right now. That, like I said, are kind of interesting in that they are uniquely not specialized for dinosaurs. They just kind of do their thing. They're just kind of generalist herbivores. But like I said, hanging out with bigger stuff is a great way to protect yourself. Think about a remora does today. Those fish that have the suckers on their heads, so they hang out and they stick to the bottom of a shark, and because they're stuck to the bottom of a shark, everything leaves them alone. So stick next to a stegosaurus and nothing's going to try and fight you.
The fact that they were faster than other herbivores, even though their mobility was lower than most predator builds. Their higher intelligence granted them more advanced perception, letting them function as the herd lookouts. But nonetheless, these builds were helpless on their own, and were easy targets for predator mains if they were ever caught undefended. Their lack of self-sufficiency puts them in F tier in my opinion. I think they realized this though, because later on, this faction started speccing into either extra armor on their heads, or spikes on their thumbs, giving them much better options for dealing with aggressive players. In D tier, we've got two carnivore builds, the first being Coelophysis. Coelophysis was one of the first dinosaur builds that the devs introduced, and like all of the early dinosaurs, it really was nowhere near the power level of the ones that would be added to the game later in the Jurassic and Cretaceous expansions. The only reason it became such a popular and dominant build was because it starved and dehydrated more slowly than its non-dinosaur rivals. And this isn't to say that it didn't struggle to succeed too, it absolutely did, and often had to resort to team killing just to get by.
Betrayal.
It's sort of
Yeah, this is what I was talking about, where like the big early advantage dinosaurs had, and he's talking about these guys again as a very early one, even earlier than the ones we were just talking about. These are like early Triassic period dinosaurs. Not needing to be close to water was great. Overpowered for its time.
dominated the early dino meta by default, so I'm not going to rate it any higher than D tier. Also in D tier we have Spinosaurus. Spinosaurus is a unique build that specced heavily into fishing abilities and aquatic adaptations, including the rare ability of electroreception, which helped it catch fish players even when they were in stealth mode. This is great for that specific application, but Spinosaurus mains weren't actually fully aquatic. They couldn't breathe underwater and still had to spend plenty of their gameplay dealing with the challenges of being a terrestrial build. And unfortunately, their stats and abilities leave a lot to be desired in terms of contending with the terrestrial meta at that time. Because they'd spent so many evolution points adapting their build to be able to fish, they'd secured themselves a unique niche at the cost of being able to hold their own in general combat.
Grammarly does more than catch errors.
It's got an ad,
With
guys.
Grammarly, you can find really good, no, perfect.
But what he was talking about with the Spinosaurus is interesting, because I don't fully remember like that interpretation of the Spinosaur, that it was primarily a fish eater. But yeah, that rings is like not that great if you're a carnivore that's that big and terrestrial and relying on eating fish. Like that seems hard.
Carnivore mains and outsped by most herbivore mains, leaving them in an awkward position. If they'd had more time, they might have been able to gain enough experience to spec into a fully aquatic build. But unfortunately, the devs decided to up the overworld temperature, raising the sea levels but drying up the rivers, leaving the Spinosaurus player base without a niche. The lesson here is that if you ever find yourself speccing into the playstyle of an amphibian, you may want to reconsider how you're spending your evolution points. Last indeed.
I'm kind of on board with them there. Amphibians are low tier across the board. There's like not an it's hard to argue that because they've been around forever. Like clearly they're doing something right. But as far as like their prospects going forward, like amphibians are probably the thing. Like if I was to take like one class of animal and be like, this is the one that's gonna go extinct in the next 200 years, the whole class is gonna get wiped out. Like amphibians are the pick.
Here we have the Hadrosaurs. Now, I don't have a ton to say about these builds. Generally, their main game plan is pretty simple. See a predator coming and run away. This is pretty similar to the Dryosaurus and Camptosaurus playstyle I mentioned in F tier, but instead of relying on the more powerful herbivores to defend them, they had the HP required to shrug off a hit or two, and actually had the mobility required to escape, assuming they saw the attack coming. Overall, this build was pretty easy to play, but had a low skill ceiling as well, since they had no actual combat abilities. All in all, there's a reason players consider Hadrosaurs more forgettable among dinosaur builds. In C tier, we've got two of the most famous Jurassic builds. The first is Stegosaurus. Taking a quick look at the Stegosaurus' stats, it's clear that this build was extreme on many fronts. It had one of the lowest intelligence levels of any dinosaur, and also didn't exactly have much in terms of mobility either. However, it had pretty incredible combat stats and powerful abilities to back it up. Most notably, its backplates and Thagomizer.
I was gonna say, I feel like this feels low for Stegosaurus to me, but a lot of that is predicated on what his interpretation or what theory he's gonna be rolling with as far as what the backplates are for. So we'll see where he goes from that. If he thinks they're just armor, like I guess this plays because it's just a big lumbering carnivore or herbivore that doesn't really have a ton going for it other than tail spikes, and that just needs to eat a ton. But I've seen some folks speculate that the plates on the back were maybe like an energy, like a solar absorption thing that would have helped them stay warm and be more active, basically. And I think in that case, like, the back plates alone bump it up.
Their back plates significantly reduce the chance of an attacker scoring a critical hit against them, since it's much harder to bite down on a Stegosaurus's weak point when there are plates in the way. Their back plates can also be flushed with blood to grant a large intimidation buff, which works great against predator and herbivore mains alike. The Thagomizer is one of the most unique weapons of any dinosaur build. The Thagomizer has one of the highest critical hit chances of any weapon in the game, often dealing enough damage to one-shot most players. Because it's a tail spike, this attack has a lot of reach, making approaching a defending Stegosaurus player extremely difficult. However, the strategy was by no means perfect. Their low mobility made fleeing from battle impossible, so if an enemy did know how to subvert its defenses, Stegosaurus mains would be out of options, and since their tails weren't long enough to cover an attack from the front, that was often their downfall. Thankfully, their base game plan was relatively simple, so their low intelligence didn't hinder them too much. Also in C tier, we have every Stegosaurus main's arch-enemy, Allosaurus. The Allosaurus build was unique in that it actually invested very little into the bite attack, only having the bite strength of a lion. Instead, Allosaurus dealt damage by using its head like a battle axe, swinging its open jaw down onto an enemy player. This dealt heavy damage but was nowhere near the devastating power of some of the top tier dinosaur combat moves. It had the highest top speed of any build during its time, but had relatively low stamina, meaning it could only sprint for a short time, also similar to lions today.
Yeah, this feels like a little controversial to me too, having Allosaurus this low. Because the other aspect of Allosaurus is a lot of times, and he's doing this too, is he's comparing it to the other big theropods. But to the best of my knowledge, and he said these guys are hunting Stegosauruses, so these guys actually predate, like, T-Rex, basically. And the other bigger theropods all come later than this. So it's hunting in a different environment, too, where I don't know if just the direct bite force is as necessary.
While one-on-one, Allosaurus tended to get bodied by the strong...
And pack hunting's great. Like, anything that pack hunts automatically gets bumped up like a tier or two, in my opinion.
Stronger herbivore players of its time. In packs, they could take down just about anything. Overall, a solid mid-tier, whose strategies got expanded upon and refined by the later dinosaur builds. In B-tier, we have a few builds which did the exact opposite of what Allosaurus did, in that they put a ton of evolution points into a single combat tactic. First, the build which spec'd into the claw skill tree, granting it the longest claws to ever exist in the game, Therizinosaurs. Therizinosaurs were excellent in 1v1 combat because their claws gave them incredible reach and damage, perfect for slicing at the heads of carnivore mains that were trying to bite them. Their slash attack was the strongest the game had ever seen. In fact, they put so many points into the claw skill tree that they had none left over for teeth or mobility and were actually forced to change teams from the carnivore side to the herbivore side, making them the only build from the theropod faction to opt not to be a predator. This actually worked out really well for them because they no longer had to compete with the other predator mains for XP, and were also taller than most herbivore players typically seen in the forest biomes. Sure, they were lacking in intelligence and mobility, and also couldn't actually gain any experience from the enemies that they defeated with their claws, but all in all, they had a surprisingly effective strategy. Not a perfect defense, as they were definitely still vulnerable to coordinated assaults, but definitely an above average build.
See, and this feels high to me for this thing. Like, yeah, I get that the claws are a cool gimmick, but, like, if you're gonna be relying on claws, like, why are you putting them on arms that are as small as, like, the average theropod arm is? Like, there's not a lot of competition, as he was saying, like, in, like, these denser forest areas for a large an animal this size for food, so you just get to, you know, get free food forever by just munching on leaves that are too tall for anything else in the forest to deal with. But I think he's putting a lot more weight on those claws than what they probably actually deserve.
On the opposite end of the spectrum from Allosaurus and Therizinosaurs, both of which had either weak or non-existent bite damage, we have the carnivore build that put all of its evolution points into maxing out the bite attack, the Tyrannosaurus Rex. T-Rex had the most powerful bite attack in the history of the game, able to take out any player it was able to bite in a single hit. This also gave it the ability to crush bone, letting it access the XP-rich marrow inside, similar to what hyenas do in today's meta. T-Rex was a hybrid between a predator
And so if he's putting T-Rexes in B tier, I guess I'm less mad at Allosauruses being in C tier. Like, if he had put T-Rex in, like, A tier or S tier and had Allosaurus be that low, I would have had beef there. But now I'm intrigued. Now I want to see what he does put up high. Notably, my favorite dinosaur has not shown up yet, which I'm glad that he is seemingly an Ankylosaur appreciator like I am.
And scavenger build. It didn't have the greatest luck taking
He hasn't
down
done ceratopsids either
in
yet.
the Cretaceous expansion, but it could certainly defeat them if the T-Rex players worked in a group. And as a scavenger, its massive size gave it the ability to steal kills from other carnivore players who had no hope of surviving its devastating bite if they got in its way. T-Rex did, however, have to sacrifice all of its other offensive strengths in order to maximize its bite damage. Its arms were so short that its claw attack had pathetic range, making them useless both for holding prey and fighting rivals for territory. And it also wasn't particularly fast outside of short bursts of speed.
One of my other favorite things I always love about these like 3D recreations of dinosaurs is like how they decide like what color and patterns to put on them. Like those T-Rexes are hilarious looking. Like it has a skull painted on its face. Presumably to make it look more imposing, like more intimidating, but more intimidating to who? Like a human audience who's watching a documentary. Like, I feel like there's not a whole lot of reason why you, as a T-Rex, would, like, make your head look like a skull. Like, another T-Rex doesn't recognize that as a skull and, like, get spooked at a skeleton like a human does.
Coming, which wasn't that hard because of its massive size. They wouldn't have too tough a time avoiding it. Still, with team strats, it was near unstoppable, and it always had the option to fall back on scavenging, so it was definitely a solid high tier.
So I feel like the thing he's going to put at the very top are going to be, like, dromaeosaurs, like the raptors, basically, I think is going to be the thing he ends up putting on top. Unless he, like, plays it where he's going to say, like, oh yeah, birds are dinosaurs, and he's going to put birds up high, because I know he likes birds.
The last B-tier build I want to talk about is Triceratops. In terms of defense in a single direction, no build has ever come close to Triceratops. Their horns can deal massive damage in a single swing, even to giant carnivore builds like T-Rex. Looking at its stats, it's pretty clear that going head-to-head with this thing would end badly. However, one thing I've noticed is that players nowadays fail to remember its main drawback, low intelligence. This thing was pretty close to a modern-day opossum in terms of brain power. And as many of you should know from my Australia video, marsupials are some of the least intelligent mammals. People assume Triceratops behaved similar to a modern-day elephant, since both are about the same size and sport powerful front-facing weaponry. However, the herd behavior that makes elephants so untouchable by
they're not elephants, they're bison.
Predators was absent in the Triceratops build as they were mostly solitary, and this was due to their low intelligence stat. Because of that, they were highly vulnerable from being attacked from behind, or from multiple angles at once. Triceratops' low intelligence also meant that it was easily tricked into walking into ambushes set by carnivore mains, which pretty much always meant a game over for the Triceratops. As powerful as this build is, and it is powerful, don't get me wrong, I think it's definitely not a top tier dinosaur and caps out at B tier.
Yeah, I feel like putting Triceratops over Stegosaurus is weird. Basically for all the stuff he's saying as a negative, except Triceratops is a later dinosaur and is having to deal with a lot more pack hunters than what Stegosaurus is. Like, the issue Stegosaurus has is its defenses from the front are bad. Whereas with Triceratops, it's the defenses on the back that are bad. But like I said, there's a lot more stuff that's pack hunting in the Cretaceous than there is in the Jurassic. So I feel like for the time period it existed in, it's probably a less effective dinosaur and should be a lower tier. Or bump Stegosaurus up a tier.
Okay, so in A tier we've got the dinosaurs which were a bit smarter about how they invested their evolution points. First we have the Dromaeosaurus, the faction of dinosaurs that includes builds like Velociraptor, Deinonychus, and Utahraptor.
Say so much for
These
my
players made an interesting choice to forego the
prediction that they were going to be number one.
Dinosaurs so dominant in the first place, and try their hand at more of an evasive rushdown playstyle, sacrificing both their HP and defense stats to buff their mobility and deep.
Is he going to put like Parasaurolophus as really high? I wonder why that is.
DPS as best they could. Most notably, they spec'd into buffing a single claw on each foot, which had two important functions. The first being that it could deal massive slash and stab type damage, and the second being that it gave them the ability to hook onto players that they were targeting using the pounce attack. Overall, this build had much higher damage than normal for a build that size, and could easily take down players in a much higher weight class, especially if they attacked in a group, which they often did. They had the ability to weave in and out of their opponent's attack range easily, letting them bait out and dodge attacks. The one main drawback to this build was that if it
Google Fi, a phone plan by Google.
Oh, it's gonna be
It's easy to switch
like
to Fi
the,
from the comfort of your home. Purchase a new
the sauropods. The long neck things are gonna be number one. It's gonna be the sauropods, is what it's gonna be.
take lethal damage in a single hit, but overall, this faction was one of the most successful at the time and easily A tier. Also in A tier we have Dinosaur, a build very similar to T-Rex in terms of appearance, but with a slightly different plan of attack. Instead of investing purely into bite force, maxing out base damage, Dinosaur spent its evolution points speccing into advanced, serrated teeth. This gave their bite attack an increased chance to cause the heavy bleed status effect, which would drain the target's HP and stamina over time. This was more cost effective than pure bite force, and let them retain enough evolution points to spec into claws too, giving them a more well-rounded combat style that could still cause lethal damage from a single bite. This strategy is similar to the one seen employed by the Komodo dragon player base of today's meta. Dinosaur was also one of the tankier carnivore builds and could shrug off a hit or two even from the builds that would normally devastate anything that they landed a hit on. This made them extremely good at PvP against the other carnivore builds at the time, making them an easy high tier candidate. The next build I have in A tier is Ankylosaurus, perhaps the best tank build
That's
ever
fair.
to exist in the game.
I'm
This
fine
build
with that.
essentially took the Stegosaurus
I said, as long as you have it above Stegosaurus and Triceratops, I'm not mad at Ankylosaurs being in A rather than S.
strategy and cranked it up to the most extreme it could. Instead of backplates for intimidation, the Ankylosaur players spec'd into armor, and instead of tail spikes they opted for a club. Their armor was so impenetrable that it made attacks from even the strongest carnivore mains pretty laughable. While their club didn't have a high crit chance like the tail spikes did, it did do massive damage that could shatter bone, capable of crippling any player unfortunate to take a direct hit from it. Ankylosaurus was near invincible except that it had one glaring flaw. Despite all of its defense and power, it was completely helpless if a player managed to flip it over. For that reason, I can't place it in top tier, because a good top tier will have no surefire counterplay. Last in A tier we have Troodon. The Troodon build was the only dinosaur build whose core strategy was based around the intelligence stat. Sure, other dinosaurs used team strategies or had
This is the
advanced
thing from the
perception
intro.
skills, both of which require some usage of intelligence. But Troodon was the only one to specifically tailor their build around having its brain be its best weapon. Troodon had to sacrifice a lot to get this. High intelligence requires a lot of calories to maintain, so getting the kills required to sustain both a large size and a large brain was impossible, meaning that they had to give up gigantism as a trait. So instead of powerful dagger-like claws, Troodon opted for smaller but opposable claws that could be used to pick up objects. This severely cut its potential in combat, but gave it a lot of options in terms of manipulating its environment to, for example, set up traps to catch players that would otherwise be able to evade them. It's very possible that if non-avian dinosaurs weren't banned in the Meteor Strike balance patch, Troodon players would have eventually leveled up their intelligence enough to become top tiers similar to humans. But even though it was starting to gain the power to dominate its environment, it still had no way to combat the other top.
Again, going back to like artist recreations, it's very interesting that like when they're speculating at like, oh, a thing that like could have potentially continued to develop and become sentient, they also just like put it in a human body and give it human proportions and everything. Like our legs being that proportion like don't have a whole lot to do with our intelligence. So it's just interesting whenever you see these recreations, like what liberties they take and what they decide to speculate on and how they like to make the appearances. Like I said, they turn this thing into functionally a human just with green skin when they want to make it look like a sentient, intelligent thing. Like, why can't it be still like a dinosaur and be intelligent? Like, why is it gotta suddenly have human legs? Oh.
But even though it was starting to gain the power to dominate its environment, it still had no way to combat the other top tiers aside from just running away, so it definitely wasn't S tier. In S tier, we have the most overpowered dinosaur faction of all, the sauropods. Sauropods had every tool they needed to counter all other dinosaur builds. They had the maximum HP stat possible for a terrestrial build, and because they used the herd strategy, oftentimes this meant that if a sauropod player was caught off guard and was under attack by several carnivore players, it could usually tank enough hits that its teammates would have time to rescue it. And of all the dinosaurs, sauropods also had the largest attack range. Their whip-like tails may have not had the same damage per hit that Stegosaurus or Ankylosaurus did, but they were still plenty powerful, able to knock down enemies well out of reach of a counterattack. And if they did get too close, a sauropod's stomp attack was literally the most devastating move in the game, knocking the target down and dealing lethal damage. Lastly, their extreme height gave them a massive advantage for avoiding stealth attacks, as they could see much further than other players. In terms of land superiority, sauropods truly were the most overpowered dinosaurs of all time.
Another interesting thing in his silhouettes here as we're looking at what I assume is the whole tier list. The sauropod silhouette he has is notably has its head held up very high, which is kind of uncommon as far as the way you'll see sauropods depicted a lot of the time these days. And it was very common when I was like a kid. This was a lot of times how they were drawn, as kind of having the same shape as like a giraffe except bigger. But nowadays it's a lot more common to see them more horizontally oriented, so like the tail and the head are about the same level most of the time, and the neck is just really long but kind of parallel to the ground. And the big thing that kind of triggered that change in thinking as far as like how they were probably spent most of their time oriented was someone was like trying to figure out the physics of their like cardiovascular systems, and figured out that like in order for a sauropod to be able to actually pump blood to its head, its heart would have to be the size of like a car. Like you don't have enough space in your chest cavity to make a heart big enough to pump blood that high if you're carrying your head around like that all the time. And so that's, I said, what ultimately prompted a kind of rethinking of how they must have been oriented when they were walking around. Because then, I mean, it's tricky with dinosaurs is that you basically only ever have the skeletons, and you can speculate and you can give your best guess as far as how those bones all fit together, but as I said, sometimes you get stuff wrong.
It's unfortunate that the devs chose to ban the dinosaurs during the KT balance patch, but alas, the meta was getting stale, so I understand why. Hopefully you enjoyed this look back at the Mesozoic meta. If you enjoy watching videos about dinosaurs, there are a bunch of great documentaries I can recommend. For example, if you're curious about Troodon and why it was the smartest dinosaur ever, I have to recommend Leaps in Evolution, a documentary detailing the evolution of brains and intelligence. But if you just want a good, fun dinosaur story, one of my personal favorites is The Ballad of Big Al, a documentary that follows the life story of a single Allosaurus as it learns to hunt and survive in the Jurassic. HP stat possible for a terrestrial build.
Let's go back and see if we can take a look at the actual list here. There we go. Alright. So, as I like putting sauropods on top. Sauropods are great. I'm fine Ankylosaur being where it is. I feel like he was kind of pulling some really like specific niche ones to kind of fill out here. It's like really like the Troodon versus like your standard other Dromaeosaur. Like, yeah, the model's a little different, but I mean, he also pulled 3 different theropods that are all mostly doing the same thing too here and put them on different tiers. Whereas, you know, he didn't give that same granularity to like the sauropods, where, you know, he didn't have, oh, we're going to put an Apatosaurus and a Diplodocus and, you know, et cetera, on there. I said, I feel like you swap Stegosaurs and Triceratops if I'm making this. Or maybe I don't swap them. Maybe I just bump Stegosaurus up and I bump this, the herbivorous theropod that he talked about down a level or 2. I think I bump raptors up to S tier too on mine, the dromaeosaurs. Like, I think they were great. Like, and I mean, there's something to be said for the fact that they are the only dinosaurs that still exist. They're the only things that did survive the KT extinction, and we have them to this day as birds. But I think we'll swap over to face cam here. I think we'll call that a wrap for today. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Hopefully you guys have some thoughts on where you think those dinosaurs belong to. Thank you all for watching. Like I said, this will be up on YouTube if you want to go back and check the VOD. It's there. Shout outs to Beltrami Electric Co-op. And also, what else we got? Oh yeah, our schedule. So the Headwaters Science Center is open right now. We're open Monday through Saturday from 9:30 to 5 o'clock. And then we're open on Sundays from 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock. So coming after lunch on Sundays, but we're open all day, every other day. And that's going to be our schedule all the way up through Labor Day. So all summer long. But again, thank you all for watching. Thanks for tuning in. Tomorrow, what is tomorrow? Today's Thursday. So for tomorrow's Friday. I honestly don't know who's going to be on the show on Friday, but Saturday is going to be a snake feeding. So if you're interested in seeing the snakes eat, that's going to be this coming Saturday. Other than that, again, thanks for watching, and we will